Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Great to have you with us, those of you guys who are here, and those of you guys who are watching online via the live stream. Great to have all of y'all with us for what I think is going to be, an interesting and always a timely conversation, busting the school bureaucracy, a curriculum for cage-busting teachers. Most of you who are watching this are probably familiar. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book with the help of the folks on stage and many of you all in this room and who are probably watching, called The Cage-Busting Teacher. The premise was real simple. It's that so many teachers I worked with a quarter century ago when I started teaching, so many teachers I've engaged with over the decades are frustrated by their schools, by their systems, by their school districts, by public policies, and teachers aren't always sure what you actually do about any of this. They share their frustration in teachers' lounges. They could share their frustration via angry tweets, but none of that's very likely to create the kinds of schools and systems where they can do the best work, where they can make a difference for kids. Cage-Busting Teacher was an attempt to help teachers channel that energy, those concerns, in productive avenues. Part of the problem I pointed out was that teachers don't have a lot of positional authority. When it comes to school districts, teachers can't make things happen just by dint of wanting to. That means they need to know how to talk to principals, how to reason with central office administrators, and how public policy works. The book was meant as something of a how-to guide on that, and I'm pleased to say that some teachers have used it in just such a way. But there's also the case that not all teachers out there are plugged into networks to help them use the book. Folks like Hope Street Group, or NSTOY, or Educators for Excellence, or Teach Plus, or Leading Educators have been fantastic partners as well by using it to some degree, by helping folks use it. But there's also teachers out there who are isolated, teachers who are in training programs where they don't have access to these materials. What I've tried to do is put together, with the help of our friends at NSTOY and of our terrific Jen Hatfield at AEI, a kind of a free online curricular tool to help teachers guide themselves through the book in a way that can help them more effectively deal with frustration. The hashtag for today's event is going to be, is it cage busting, Jen? Yes. Cage busting. The event is not only being live streamed, but it'll be available on the AEI website. Before we get started, they always ask me to ask you all to silence all cell phones. Again, I would like to offer a formal thanks to the National Network of State Teachers of the Year, NSTOY, and their terrific leader, Catherine Bassett, for the help in putting this thing together. And before I go ahead and give you guys just a quick 2-3 minute walkthrough through what this tool looks like, I want to take a moment just to introduce the panelists who've been kind enough to join us today to talk about some of these issues, why teachers get frustrated, what they can do about it, and how we can help them tackle these challenges. I'm going to work from the other side over to closer. First, Josh Parker. Josh is with the Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., where he's an instructional coach. Josh was Maryland State Teacher of the Year in 2012. He's also was a Pearson Global Fellow in 2013. And he actually began his career as a sports producer for Fox 45 in Baltimore before becoming a classroom educator. Next up is Peggy Stewart. Peggy's the Director of Professional Learning for the National Network of State Teachers of the Year. She also served as Director of Professional Development at the New Jersey Center for Teaching and Learning and is Chair of the New Jersey Professional Teaching Standards Board. She was New Jersey State Teacher of the Year in 2005 for her work as a high school social studies teacher. Diana Wenzel is the Commissioner of Education for the state of Connecticut. She's also served as the Chief Academic Officer for Connecticut State Department of Ed, as Assistant Superintendent of Schools in Hartford, Connecticut, and in various district leadership positions. Diana began her career in education as a social studies teacher, and then as a teacher for gifted kids. And finally, Wendy Obtain of the Hope Street Group. Wendy's the Research and Development Lead for Strategic Initiatives at Hope Street, which is a national organization that promotes policies that improve economic opportunity. Wendy founded the Hope Street Group Fellowship, which is a program for teachers to learn about and influence ed policy. Previously, she worked on early learning at the U.S. Department of Education and taught in the classroom for a number of years. We're going to get to talk with them in just a moment. Before we do, though, I just want to take a moment to make sure folks here and online get a chance to just see what we're talking about is way of the new cage-busting teacher resource. You can find this on the AEI homepage. What it is a simple justification and explanation of the curriculum, how it's intended to be used, whether self-directed in professional learning communities as a group book study. There are 7 modules available online, which pretty much walk individuals or groups through the book. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, let's take a quick look at Module 1, which I see right now we're on page 19, so it's probably suboptimal. Start there. And these are really pretty straightforward. There's nothing complicated about them. These are freely available online. The only resource anybody needs for these things to be helpful is the Cage Busting Teacher book. And basically what these are intended to do is help folks or help groups work their way through the book in the most fruitful possible fashion. So thinking about what is the cage, we use anecdotes from the book to help people think about this in terms of teachers, their reactions to what we shared, drawing connections to their own experience, trying to use simple breakdowns to make sense of the points in the book, give teachers a chance to think about and react to the material before them. There's a variety of activities from time diaries, for instance, tracking their own activity for a week, to figuring out exactly how much money is being spent by their school and where those dollars are going, to various videos from folks who are particularly highlighted in the book, such as Jacob Pachter from Indiana, sharing their stories and anecdotes, giving teachers a chance to then react to those and interact. There's also a variety of opportunities for directed discussion or for role-playing. And at the end of the day, the expectation here is what we're really trying to do is just give teachers a chance to work through these materials in a way that's going to make a difference for them. All right. I mean, that's all I wanted to share. There's the 7 modules. They're up here, all freely available. But what I really want to do is take our time today to talk with these folks who actually do this work about a couple of big questions. Let's start with the first. The Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, got a lot of attention last week when she went to a school. She visited a school in D.C., and she mentioned after the fact that it had struck her that teachers were in receive mode, which seemed a troubling characterization to a lot of observers. She later explained what she meant, which I think resonated at least for me, and maybe with some of y'all, which is she was talking about teachers being frustrated by the rules, by the need to kind of wait for directives as to what to do, and as not really being empowered to use their best judgments to serve kids. Setting aside her saying that, I'm kind of curious, how much of that do you guys find is the reality in schools that you work in, that you support, that you visit? And to the extent that you find that to be the case, why? Josh.
So, first off, thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your work in this space, not just the book, but in this space. So thank you. I work in, of course, Paul Laurence. We call it the historic Paul Laurence Dunbar High School in D.C. And I can tell you that part of my job is dealing with the frustration of teachers that I coach. And so it's a reality because a lot of them, which are first-year teachers and also second-year teachers, they come in with these ideas about, here's what I can do, I can conquer the world, and then reality comes in, right? Reality is the students that are in front of them that may not share their affinity for long prose and poems, but also the reality is there are so many different mandates, district, state, local, school, that they have to juggle and manage while still wanting to teach like they really want to teach. And so part of my job as an instructional coach has been to try to untangle it for them. So sometimes I'm their middleman between administration and the district and what they can do, and they have to stick to the curriculum, but then the curriculum is at such a pace sometimes. There's students that are 2 and 3 grade levels below reading, can't keep up. And so the frustration is, I want to do something, but every time I step out of a certain cage or box, I get a slap on the wrist, I get a nasty email from their instructional coach, not all the time. So it's difficult. And I share their frustration because I've been on both sides. I've been a teacher that's wanted to do things, but also have to really understand where the district initiatives are. So it's really about translating. A lot of my job is translating how you can still do both while maintaining your freedom, and it is a difficult balance.
I would also add, thank you also for the opportunity to be here, but I would add that the schools that I go into to work with the teachers, they talk about the organizational structure. So the idea is that, yeah, they're in receive mode. They've not had a chance to even say whether they think the programs they're implementing are any good. They're told maybe in the last week in August, that's September, they're starting a new math program, or, and it means all new textbooks or new programs online, whatever they're using. But it's a constant, we call it initiative overload, right? That all the initiatives that are being thrown literally at teachers, and sometimes you read it in an email, sometimes maybe you've heard it in the hallway, so you don't even always have that communication line that lets you know what's happening with all the details that you need. So I heard a metaphor the other day that if you've ever gone into a batting cage, so Josh, you can probably relate to this. I have never been in a batting cage.
I've not done well in one, but go ahead.
And I heard that, so let's say the balls are coming, you're practicing your batting, and they might be coming every 30 seconds. I'm making that up. I don't know if that's how long. So when the balls are coming at you, you're trying to figure and get ready. Well, as a teacher, it's like you're in a batting cage, but it's gone dysfunctional. So they're coming not at a set pace, but you don't know when they're coming, and you can't get out of the cage, and you're just swatting, and then you don't know which ones to hit and which ones not to. And I think it really hits home for helping teachers not know what to prioritize, and often not having a chance to catch their breath, to even think, what does it mean? What does it mean for me, my colleagues, my students, my workload, right? So, yeah, I think those frustrations.
Wendy, one of the things that you've pointed out over time and that Hope Street Group has helped teachers with is that teachers don't always know how to engage in this stuff. Even when they're trying to talk to somebody about the frustration Peggy pointed, like something's getting introduced on them at the end of the year, or excuse me, at the end of the summer. Could you talk a bit about what teachers don't know and maybe why, or what goes wrong?
Yeah, so this was actually going through my head when you first asked the question. So for me, I went through a traditional certification route, went through university, and when I think about my preparation, and as I've talked to teachers all around the country about their preparation, none of us ever received any class. There was never a class. There was never any curriculum to share with us about the education system, what that looked like, what we were walking into. And so I think when you focus on the curriculum and the content and classroom management in your preparation program, you are prepared to only focus on those things. And so then when you all of a sudden walk into a school and you realize there is a bureaucracy within, you're in the school, within a district, within the state, and then there's the federal system, you have no idea how all of those things intersect or interact or how they end up ultimately affecting you. So you mentioned the fellowship program. That was my intent with launching the fellowship program, was to address the gap that existed, which is to say, teachers, you want to be able to understand the system that you're in, but you don't know how to navigate that. And I guess for me, I pulled myself out of the classroom and I went and pursued a master's in public administration. And so I took my classroom knowledge and then that policy knowledge to sort of merge that together to say, here's what I really wish that I would have known when I was in the classroom.
Diana, I mean, you've lived this from every piece of the pie.
I think, one of the things that Wendy said that really resonates is the idea of the skill piece. And I think teachers all at the same time already have the skills they need to influence policy, but they just don't know it. If you can get 125 eighth graders to think that, the French and Indian War is the most interesting thing they could possibly be dealing with this morning. You probably can figure out how to get the Board of Ed to approve the new thing that you really want to do with your colleagues. You just don't know yet how to translate, and I love the word that you used, to translate that skill into the policy arena. And I agree, just some simple graphics in teacher prep of like, here's your school, here's your principal, there's a superintendent. The principal can't do everything he wants to do or she wants to do. And that you live within some sort of ecosystem that is political, and that's not a bad word,
This translation question comes up all the time, right? We talk about kids, about code switching. Are there cases that come to mind where you've been like, oh gosh, that's just not the right way to kind of talk to this legislator, talk to this board member, or I'm curious, like an example or two, because those can be illustrative.
I think that comes up all the time. You have some great examples in the book with certain keywords, like if people don't know that the word pilot it has all kinds of critical meanings, and we have all these rules around that. And I think we see that a lot when teachers first try to influence policy. They step on words that are so important to certain advocate groups or who have entrenched connections to legislators. So like we do a legislative 101 for our teacher leaders to try to say like, well, this person's been on the State Board of Ed for this long and this is what they really care about. Sort of just learn how to, the way you would in a class, you learn the sociogram of your class, and you kind of have to learn the sociogram of your political layout too.
Wendy, I mean, you've talked about this. There's some basic intuitions that you've shared with folks to like help them. What are a couple of things where folks you've seen kind of get it wrong and then get it right the next time?
Well, so I'll say that first out of the gate, when teachers are given this opportunity to build a relationship or make a connection with a policymaker, they tend to speak like they do in the copy room. Which is their instant reaction is to complain or to be frustrated at something. And so one of the things that we've really focused on and with our teachers, and I think the teachers have done a fantastic job, is to be solutions oriented. So to come to the meeting or to come to a conversation ready to discuss opportunities for growth and new things that can be, that they're excited about leading themselves. I think that last piece is important too, something that they're volunteering, so they're not just bringing something, an idea for someone else to do, they're bringing an idea that they are willing to implement themselves.
So I mean, all of you guys are, in organizations or work with organizations that are trying to help teachers build these skills. But like we just talked about, like Wendy, like you were just mentioning in your own teacher prep, that's not historically been part of how we've prepared teachers in teacher preparation. It's not historically been a part of professional development. Why not? Why haven't we thought about this as much over time as we might?
I don't know that it's that we haven't thought about it as much as when I know in New Jersey, when I've been at meetings with higher ed looking at teacher prep programs, one of the problems they face is, what do we cut out? How do we weave it in so that it makes sense and it's just not isolated, but it really has some meaning, some teeth to it? And then if that's the case, what do we get rid of for time's sake? And that's a real challenge, I think.
I think about when you were talking about the back cage and how it comes out different particular times. I was thinking about this idea that teachers are in a back cage with 4 different dispensers, right? We're just talking about managing up in different aspects of the book, but they're doing this while teaching kids every day, right? And then while teaching kids every day, there's also having a personal life, right? And then there's also this idea of, how do I continue to build on my expertise? There are a couple of teachers in my department that do school. Then because we have students that are struggling, they do after school. And then because they're trying to advance in their own profession, they're doing their own school. So there's a lot of these things coming up. And I think that because of that, it puts a pressure on teacher prep programs to make sure that the teachers are ready with these particular pieces, but not only do they miss this idea of the political structure, but they miss this idea of ethics. A lot of teacher prep programs don't cover educator ethics, right? And that's a critical piece of being a professional. There's a fellowship that I recently had the opportunity to start with Instoy for outstanding Black male educators. And the principal reason for it is because I, in my career, went through some really bad memories, bad examples of trying to deal with this political aspect. And when I learned, I want to pass it on. so that we can understand just as professionals, how can we manage this cage in a really successful way?
You know, I mean, this is so well said, right? Because the last thing we need to do is one more list of things that
Right.
teachers need to spend time worrying about.
Right.
But part of it, right? I always say, if teachers were just psychiatrists to the home office,
Right.
and they hung out a shingle and they shrugged up their bathrobe and put down their coffee and went, we wouldn't need to talk about any of this because patients would show up at 10:10 and leave at 11. But teachers are part of these schools,
Right.
and when kids are misbehaving in the hallways, it bleeds over even if you've tried to close your door. And if your principal is being inconsistent, or if the bell schedule is goofy, or if announcements waste your time, you can't insulate yourself no matter how much you try to hide behind those four walls.
Right.
And so part of this is, I think what gets lost is it's not about one more thing for teachers to do.
Right.
This is about how do teachers bring their professional acumen so that they can have the schools and systems that let them do their best work. Diane, I mean, this has obviously been a passion of yours, and this is something. How have you tried to talk to superintendents? How have you tried to talk to administrators in Connecticut to tackle this?
Well, we've tried some formal ways and also some informal ways in terms of building teacher leadership structures. One of the things I worry about is that we turn it into another thing, that these special people get to do this when somebody lets them. And what I think that one of the things that's most important is to talk to teachers about what's getting in the way of you creating the environment you want for your students? What's getting in the way of you connecting with your colleagues in building the professional learning communities you want to provide? And we don't, as a bureaucracy, really have a good enough structure for that yet. But we've started to have a lot more teacher leadership infused groups, and we have a position at the department that's related to bringing teacher leaders in so they can advise us so we don't forget, or decide that we think we know what teachers need and want. And a lot of it really does come down to the working conditions issues. Like when you talked about the announcements, that's not a small thing. You're finally getting the kids where they need to be in this great conversation, and all of a sudden we have 10 minutes of finding out, what's happening after school. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is how to keep people up for the game, because it's not going to, all of a sudden, nobody's going to make it all nice for you. Like, nobody's going to create the structure that you want to teach in and live in. You have to do that every day yourself with your colleagues. So how are you going to gain the influence first with the people sitting nearest to you to be more than just one voice, and then to begin to spread that influence in your environment and stay at the same time, sustain yourself to stay up for the game?
I want to talk in a moment about what are some of the things teachers need to learn or skills they need to build to do that. But what does that look like? Can you all just kind of give us a couple examples of what it looks like for teachers to be able to have that kind of impact, not just being, terrific teachers for the kids in their classroom, but helping create the kinds of schools where they and their colleagues can do their best work? What's that look like when teachers have been successfully engaged on that?
I'm sorry.
No, you
Some
go
of
ahead.
it is information sharing. And so opening up and flattening the leadership structure in a building, right? So sometimes the administrative leadership team has one set of information, then the other teachers have one set. If we flatten that out where everybody gets the same information, teachers can begin to understand from a building level, not just a classroom level, what's going on in our building, and they're better able to actually give solutions. And when they give solutions, it gives them freedom over their work. So this idea of managing up was one of the aspects of the book. Like, they can do that when they know what's really going on. A lot of my teachers are surprised. I had a meeting with them recently, and we just talked about some of the experiences on Park. They had no idea what the history had been. They had no idea how the students were really, in some ways, defeated by the park. And it really changed the nature of how they did their job on a day-in,
How
day-out
so?
basis.
Can you say a couple more
Well,
words?
they said, you know what? If they're frustrated with the length of the readings and they just can't sit still, we have to build that reading stamina. So we need more time in our lesson to deal specifically with having students focus on reading, comprehending, and then that's when I come in as an instructional coach and give them during reading strategies to help with that process. So now it's not me telling them and coming top down. They understand, wow, based on information from last year, we weren't here, students were defeated by long passages. I know that from my administration. So now what can we do together to solve this problem? And they feel like their work is making a difference. That doesn't happen if they're not invited in the room and they're not seated at the table. And so once we get teachers in that conversation, they can understand how the macro affects the micro, then they can start making those decisions that govern their work.
So, I mean,
No, I couldn't agree more with that. I think that idea of the solution table, where people are part of constructing the solutions and teachers' voices are part of that, is the most important element.
So, but this also brings up this point. Teachers often say, well, heck, we're not invited into the room. Nobody's asking us. Help folks who are wrestling with that. What's the right way to think about that dilemma?
So I have a thought about that, actually. I was talking to one of my teacher friends yesterday about, she was a career changer. And I've actually talked to a number of friends of mine, colleagues, who were career changers to get into the teaching profession. And one trend that I noticed amongst all of them is that they did not ask. They don't come into the mentality to ask to be, they're not timid to request a meeting with the superintendent. They're not intimidated to write their representative and want to go sit down or invite them into the classroom. And I thought that was a really interesting observation, that it's almost as if when you're raised in the system, raised in the cage, like you feel it so closely around you and you don't feel like you can break out. But if you're coming from another setting and you come into the profession, those bars are not necessarily there. So, I mean, I would say teachers don't ask, just do. You have a lot of power.
Well, and I think part of cage busting requires keeping new eyes, still being able to see what you could see when you were new to the environment, and like you said, if you were raised in it, you don't see it. And I think that those career changers sometimes bring us that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's always strikes me as one of the interesting things. In education, so many people start out as teachers when they're 22, they become principals in their 30s, and so there's a way of doing things. Whereas in lots of other lines of work, nonprofits, for-profits, people hopscotch around. And so they see, in some organizations, nobody would think of talking to the CEO, but other organizations, you would just walk in and in education, I feel like we often have teachers and administrators who are deprived of that kind of variety of experiences.
I think the other thing is, so, going back to the organizational structure and flattening the organization you were talking about, we need to remember, too, that if we're going to lead something, we need to set small, achievable goals. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I learned the hard way, I worked in a school where you could not request a meeting with the principal, face-to-face or email. You filled in the blue form. And when you filed your blue form, it went through a chain of command. I was speaking to a teacher yesterday that has a BAC committee and a DAC committee. They don't know what either stand for, but they know that the first one is if you just want it to go through our system in our school, it has to go through this committee before you're granted an appointment with the principal. And if it's a district-wide, you go through the D1, but they didn't know what the AC was. So the point is, that could be a real achievement as someone busting the cage, is breaking down that one barrier and finding a way to work with administrators on how we could just open up that communication network, which would be great. But the second side of that is, it's easy to find the problems, as we know, but it's more challenging to find the solutions. And so one of the things that I've been finding is, it's really, Wendy, you were alluding to that also, right, is rather than them complaining, what would you like it to look like, and really helping teachers sit down and come up with a plan of how it could be fixed in small, workable steps.
It's one thing that comes up all the time, right, is you talk to administrators about their PLs, their professional learning communities, mm-hmm. And they say, well, I know the data out there is that teachers don't always love them, but our faculty surveys are through the roof. We get 80, 90% positive responses on what we're doing. And then you meet with the teachers at that school, and they say our PLCs stink. And you say, well, but what about? They say, well, they're not taking any attention to the surveys, so we're not going to get ourselves in trouble. So we write positive. How do you break into a loop like that, where the teachers don't want to tick off the administrators find it easier to just go along with the flow, and everybody winds up frustrated but not speaking their mind?
It's so interesting. I love the operating metaphor of the cage. And if you grew up in a cage or in one or select to be in one, you're used to getting fed a certain way through bars. You're used to interacting people with barriers. And so you just kind of really operations that into your behavior until someone comes in with the key and opens up the cage and lets you out. And so for me, Teachers don't really go to teacher prep programs and learn about this. This is why we need tools like this curriculum and others. So it is incumbent upon leaders to open up the cage for them to start that dialogue. In your example, there's a feedback loop, and they just give positive because it's not going to work anyway. They've elected for the cage. That's cage behavior, right? So the idea is a leader comes in, says, what are you really feeling? What's really going on? And that, by the way, is sort of, you have to build that trust, right? Part of being an instructional coach is building relationships with all of my teachers, those that don't like what we're doing and don't like me, those that may like me, right? It's about building a relationship so you can hear what they actually feel and then make the decisions that they're looking for. I had a meeting with some teachers recently in my group, and they were just talking about the utter futility of some of our park prep ideas, and they're like, it can't be done this way, we gotta do it this way. And one person in that room was just sitting quietly. And I was just like, look, I gotta hear, like, you're not saying anything, what's going on? And so she waited until the other two went out. And she said, listen, I just don't feel like what I'm saying really matters. Like, I could say it, but you guys are gonna do what you're gonna do anyway. And I had to really, really honestly speak to her and say, nothing that you ever say doesn't matter. Right? And I will make sure as I work with the administration that what you say matters. We want you to be satisfied with your job. We don't want you just implementing our agenda. We want to work together. And so it's incumbent upon the leaders to build the relationships and then take the information and make the change to make them feel like what they're saying is valued.
So I would add to that. It's on the leaders, absolutely. I would also say there's responsibility on the teachers.
Sure.
So by way of example, well, I think I'll share what my point, and then I'll share the example. But I think that policy or changes or breaking these cages or building relationships take time.
They do.
And we forget that. We think, oh, well, I'm going to make this change right now. But sometimes that doesn't happen in a school year. Sometimes that doesn't happen in 2 school years. It could take much longer. And in the policy world, that's definitely the case. It's a much longer time frame. But so as teachers think about that, it has to be consistent messaging time and time again to really break down those barriers. So by way of example, one of our teachers, Amanda Zullo, she's up in New York. Fantastic teacher. She has her 1 foot, or at least last year, has 1 foot firmly rooted in 2 very traditional bureaucratic camps, the teachers union and higher education. And she was working on an initiative up in New York and was a representative with both of these organizations. And her union was really upset about her involvement in the work that she was doing in higher ed. And she really felt like she was doing what's best for kids. She was doing what's best for the schools of New York, the universities of New York up there, was really passionate about what she was doing. And she kept on. She kept trying to go have meetings. She would share summaries of the conversations she was having with higher ed, back with her union representatives. And finally, by the end of the year, now I'm not going to say that they all of a sudden became really good friends. At first, they were not, they actually weren't recognizing her PD days. The union was withholding some of her rights as a teacher because of her involvement. By the end of the school year, she'd gotten them to come to a couple of the meetings. So small wins, but that happened over an entire school year. Constant communication, constant positivity, not letting yourself get down just because someone's not listening or someone's being mean.
So, but so on that, if a teacher's watching and says, you know what, so you're telling me somebody to spend a year of their life going back and forth with like their union to like allow them to do a couple of professional implementations, that doesn't work. I'm talking about we've got, practice tests that are chewing up days of time that don't do any good. We've got a school where nobody listens to the people who do the work. We've got a district that every year is rolling out a new dumb initiative that wastes our time and gets in the way of us being able to really do our job. Like, what do I do about that?
Well, I think, one of the things that is, as a personality component, is people need to learn how to run the risks. Like, what if I don't? What if I don't spend 7th period prepping for the test? What's going to happen? Because I do think growing courage, both in our teachers and our leaders, is really important. Because frequently people, first of all, assign themselves the cage but then also don't recognize that they have a choice. Nobody expects teachers, I don't believe anyone, any leader expects teachers to go in and robotically implement a district plan or a state plan. They believe them to make judgments on a daily basis. So what will be the judgment you make today? So what's the risk of not doing, 30 minutes of test prep? What I might get in trouble, but
Right.
I might not.
Right.
I might get that audience I need with the principal to explain why I'm not doing that. I might, what's the risk on the other side? What are my kids losing when I make that judgment? Every single class period is a judgment call and a moment to really summon your courage.
And Wendy, and I look, because I know you've said this before. So your example there of like that year, how does that build into a teacher being able to deal with these big, more important, frustrating things? Part of it's courage, obviously, but like, what's the process?
I still think it's the same process, actually. I still think it's a matter of going forward and setting, actually, I think first it's prioritizing. There are a lot of things to be frustrated about. What is the most important thing? What is the thing that's frustrating you the most? Because you're not going to be able to go do the entire laundry list. It's setting small goals, like you were saying. So if you can identify the one or two key things, those are the things that you hone in on.
And it goes back to what you said, though, Rick, in the book, is then you have to find other people that believe that as well. So it doesn't become if you're in a we culture instead of an I culture, it's much more successful. So if you're able to really say whatever is bothering you, whether it's the testing time or whatever it is, and just start to share some information. You said earlier, I think that's the key. Let's talk about it, let's share some information, and then begin to narrow down a plan. But sometimes you break down one bar, and you've actually maybe built another bar that you didn't even see coming.
Right.
So I found that that's another challenge. Is it goes back to no doesn't mean no. No means not right now, right? Setbacks are just that. There's setbacks to rethink and move forward. But each time you're doing that, it's got to be ongoing. And I think that's your point. It's got to keep going with tackling issues one by one to be able to make that change.
And learning to negotiate.
Learning
Like
to
you
negotiate.
talked about prioritizing, and I think, when I was assistant superintendent in Hartford Public Schools, I would often ask principals, because they would say, all these district mandates, I can't do it, I can't improve my school, I can't do this. Which one thing could we take off your list? So what's the most important thing that would then make you able to, really make a difference in your school? And what are you willing to do?
Sure.
To, and it can't be, I don't want to do special ed. All right, so which one thing? And what are you willing to do, to have some accountability for making that choice?
Sure.
And it's,
And what would they say? What kind of responses would
well,
they give?
it's interesting because I think sometimes people really were ready to say, the thing I really need to do is to not do the district curriculum. And I have these teachers that are doing this fabulous other thing, and we want to try it. And we made room for that in the system because we had a managed performance empowerment system. So we would let principals take that risk until it was demonstrated they couldn't handle that risk. So sometimes they really didn't know, and that the complaining was more to not do that soul searching. But I think it really was an important strategy that, like you said, right size your goals. Which one thing do you want to try to gain momentum around?
It's funny, when I teach at UPenn, sometimes we get a bunch of UPenn principals. I remember when Arlene Ackerman was superintendent, and we get a bunch of principals who complain they didn't want to have to do the district-wide curriculum, and they said, we want flexibility. And I was like, well, flexibility to do what? And they'd be like, well, not to do the curriculum. Well, why? What do you want to do? And I think that speaks, right? Right? It's hard to lead by just not being for things. You've got to actually know what you think you're going to do for kids. Which gets us to, so the stuff you guys are talking about, what are your groups doing right now, or are you doing, or folks that you work with and admire doing to help build some of these skills? What are things that you point teachers to that you say, here's a resource, or here's a way of thinking about it, or here's somebody who I think really has good ideas? Just to give folks a sense of what are some of the places that you guys look to, or the things that you offer?
Well, I can say just being on this panel is one thing. So they'll be forced to watch this entire video tomorrow. So that's the first thing. No, but so really speaking out against what teachers can do, empowering teachers about really the idea and the art of teaching. I think sometimes just the love of teaching gets lost in all of this. So just return them back to center, to core principles. But also the fellowship that I talked to you about that I started with InStory's help and NEA Foundation, just really doing that.
So that's a national.
Correct. So we selected outstanding black male educators because we want to also focus on retention and creating a pipeline for more teachers of color. But fellowships where we actually monthly talk about, hey, here's how you are empowered in the school to break through the bureaucracy, right? The other piece too is that, like I talked about, the building the trust relationship, but also feeding into whatever feedback system your school has. So here's one thing that happened. About a month ago, we have surveys. Of course, everybody has surveys, right? So we had a survey for how the leadership team is doing. And the teachers, they did not hold back, right? There was some positives in there, but there was some stinging comments about what we're doing. And then our leadership team, our principal, had us read these comments, and it was really sobering. But then it was more sobering to have a faculty meeting and have those comments displayed, right? And the communication to the teachers was, we hear you, we're listening, here's what we're gonna do. And so the things that I point them to is curriculum course, such as the cage wrestling, which is now live, which I'm excited about, but also the fellowship is something that I do, building that relationship of trust so that I can hear them and then move on what they're saying, and then also feeding into whatever feedback loops and systems that we have, encouraging them to be honest with their feelings and then moving on their recommendations.
NSTOR's been working nationally with teachers around the nation on taking the teacher leader model standards that really show the kinds of skills that teachers need to be able to lead and be able to bust the cage, if you will.
So what are those? Say a couple words about those.
So, we have anything from working with adults, understanding how to really work with adults, how to navigate the system you work in, looking at communication pipelines, how to begin to negotiate, facilitate. When we look at egalitarian norms in a school, it's really not the policymakers, in my mind, that are the biggest challenges. It's teachers not wanting to stand out and be isolated from their peers. And there's a lot of that depending where you work. And no one wants to go to a place to work every day where they're just an outcast, right? So they're really trying to learn how to work and build, like you call it, manage up, right? But working with like-minded people first. We've also noticed teachers like to, when they're thinking of a problem they want to solve, the first thing they think of is the worst person that will hate this idea, and they, I can't do it because Joe will never go for it, And now they're realizing that, no, go with the like-minded, work with people you can and begin. So working on that, working on leading colleagues through working with data, leading colleagues in using research to help students. So all of these 7 domains, how to advocate for students and for the profession. And so they choose an area that really works for them, but the most important thing is that they begin to say, what are the skills needed, and they break it down. And the entire thing ends with using the change protocol, which is helping them. For some reason, teachers we've been working with struggle identifying a problem. I don't know if you find the same thing. They're either so big, the problems, like we want to change the world by Friday, kind of thing. And we try to really get them to say, what could we do this year? And then what could we look at each month as a piece of celebration that it's working, or revisiting what's not working. So helping them really articulate a problem around that particular area of learning, and then a plan. Who's going to help you? What are the resources? Who can support you or champion what you're doing? So that they leave with a plan that they feel they've had support from a group. Even if it's not the teachers sitting next to them in their school, they've had some support along the way, and they go and they try it, and then we follow up with how's it working. So I think that support isn't always available in a school,
right?
And a lot of people we work with are looking for support, and they have to seek it outside of where they are.
Sure. I mean, schools are just so poorly configured for this, right? I mean, most teachers spend 3-4 hours a week in the presence of other adults.
Right.
So, I always, when I'm out teaching this stuff, I always say, look, the average 24-year-old, like a DC advocacy group, gets 10 times as much opportunity to observe and interact with fellow adults as like a 20-year veteran teacher.
Correct.
Which means teachers aren't getting a chance to get the information on what's going on in their, in their district, they're not getting opportunities to just kind of talk as colleagues. I mean, that's partly built into the way schools are organized in the U.S.
Correct.
How do you help teachers compensate for that? What are the skills? What are the knowledge that they need to help them kind of more effectively advocate for themselves?
I really appreciate that so much of the conversation is focused on the skills and that teachers need. And I was thinking, I wish, like 25 years ago, when I asked my principal for leadership opportunities and I got put in charge of the fire drill committee, I wish there was something like this book or like that curriculum. But one of the things that we did at the state of Department of Ed that we did really wrong turned out to be something that gave us the chance to really learn a better way to do that with teachers. And we constructed our turnaround plans for our lowest 5% schools, needed to have a plan that was built from the ground up. So we had that idea that teachers would know what kids needed, and if we could listen to teachers, we would get good plans. But we didn't take into account that teachers wouldn't have the skills to know how to develop the plan. They knew what they didn't like going on for kids, but how to get it to the table and how to advocate for it. So our first couple of years, we really ended up with plans where the teachers later let us know that they had said what they thought they were supposed to say in the meetings, and that they really were not teacher-developed plans. So we're struggling now to support our turnaround. We have a commissioners network of up to 25 schools that can choose to put together a plan to voluntarily be in a closer relationship with the state. And the plan has to be designed in collaboration with the teachers and the parents, and if it's a high school, with the students. But we are only now learning how to try to infuse some of the skill building that we recognize that parents and teachers need to be part of that planning.
I mean, obviously this is something you guys work on, Wendy. Do you have some thoughts?
Well, I think there are now a number of fellowship programs or different opportunities, networks for teachers to get engaged with, and I think that's wonderful. I wish that I wish that those had been around 10, 12 years ago when I was in the classroom. I would have loved to be a part of one of these. But now as I'm going around and I speak all across the country to groups of teachers about opportunities that exist to get involved with things like this, I always have teachers that come up to me afterwards and say, I live in such and such place. There isn't an Educators for Excellence. There isn't, I'm not an NSTOY, or I'm not a STOY. I haven't won any sort of award. There's not a Teach Plus chapter here. Like, what's for me? Like, what can I do? What can I get involved in? And my thought is there are a number of national programs and things that and local programs that teachers can get involved in that have been around for a while. You can get involved with your teachers association. You can pursue national board certification. One of our teachers, Anna Baldwin, she's up in Montana. She's also Teacher of the Year in Montana. Actually, after having read The Cage Busting Teacher, she was inspired on the flight home and immediately emailed her principal about being able to pursue national board. She teaches on an Indian reservation in Montana, very rural. There aren't a lot of teachers who have pursued their national board certification, and she didn't really know where to begin or where to start. So she emailed her principal and basically suggested, hey, I want to get together a group of teachers to do this. And she moved through the system. She reached out to the teachers in her school to find out who else might be interested, and they started a cohort. And then she got connected to the union representative and also to the district person over professional development to help have them provide professional development to this small cohort of teachers to help them work their way through the national board process. So even though she's in a rural place in America, she was able to identify something that she could do and then work locally to be able to find the support that she needed. And then I should add, she pulled together her tribe, right? Like, she pulled together like-minded individuals who were also interested in pursuing the same course.
I would like to add on to that. There's three things I think about at the school level that help with dealing with all of this. And by the way, there is a huge emotional cost to teaching, especially in the inner city where I am, that people don't really talk about, right? So that is a piece that is not brought into discussion. We're busting cages, but there's a lot in that cage with us, right? So that's the first thing. But I think about a couple things that I do. One of them is a teaching strategy. It's called Think Aloud, which is usually when I'm solving an issue or when I'm working with administration, I sit them down and tell them what I was thinking through the process. So as I make the process transparent to them, they're able to be like, okay, that's why you did that, that's why you did that. Then the next thing I do is let them shoot their shot. All right, now I've done it, you have an idea, you pitch it to the principal. Pitch it to this, I'll help you along, I'll give you the idea, but you go ahead and do it, we'll see how it works out. The last thing I do is this is what I've been emphasizing probably for a few months, and that's acquire expertise. One of the things we talk about in teaching, we tend to, I think, major on pedagogy and minor on content knowledge to a degree, right? Both are important, but you have to be an expert in your craft and in your content. And what that will do is that will allow you to, when you manage up, when you shoot your shot, you actually have this reasoned, evidence-based stuff that you've learned. So now you come with credibility into the room where you can actually control what you're doing in a better way. And that's really made a lot of difference for some of my teachers.
I mean, historically, like one of the frustrations is if you were a teacher and you wanted to have more impact, you became an administrator.
Right.
Or if you want to turn more. And
Right.
part of the conversation, it seems like over the last 5-10 years, has been more appreciation for the importance of teachers as teacher leaders. But one of the problems with that is we immediately say, aha, how do we create new boxes on the org chart that we create teacher and instructor? So what are a couple of the things as folks think about trying to support and cultivate kind of teacher leaders and have folks really drive with this expertise, but also avoid just creating new boxes where they get people caught up in paperwork and fire drills and take them away from the stuff that matters for kids? What are some of the do's and don'ts of how to think about supporting this work?
I think, we've been working with teachers on having them just even form a definition of teacher leadership. They'll start with Jennifer York bars and talk that through and really own it, because a lot of times we're not talking about the same thing. So we need to first, I think, really help teachers decide what they're talking about when they're talking about leadership, and administrators understand. And then we've also tried to help them be really transparent in what that would look like. What does that work look like? So I've seen teachers thinking they're leading and trying to do all these great things. And then you say, how do you know you're really an effective teacher leader? I don't know, I think I am, right? So the more transparent that they can be on what it is they're trying to do, what it is they're trying to lead, and the more they communicate with administrators, with those they're working with, I think that's really helpful. This is what I'm trying to do, this is what it will look like, and this is how I'll know if it's working. But I'd like to also add, so I think that's a key piece of learning, but the second piece is you talk about something in the book, Rick, I remember about you can't have these lone superheroes, right? And it goes back to me, what Rachel Curtis says. I think it was Rachel Curtis that said, we need a culture of teacher leadership, not an isolated teacher leader in a building, because they're doomed to fail over time because there's nothing to sustain them. There's not the support they need. So what we've been trying to do is get these groups together that work together and really get rid of that I concept and say, we as leaders are leading this, and this is what it can look like. I don't know if that's helpful. But.
So to build on that, the teacher leadership is such a sexy phrase right now, and when I hear about it and I hear people throwing around the term, I think, okay, well, who are they leading? If you can't be a teacher leader if no one's following. Otherwise, you're just a rogue. As I think about this, what are ways that teachers can be leaders? You don't want to just slap a title on for the sake of greater pay or to pat someone on the back. It really needs to be meaningful. And teachers know when it's not meaningful. Teachers know if it's just a badge. As I think about some of the opportunities that I've seen, it's teachers who are given the opportunity to serve in hybrid roles, where they can be in the classroom part-time, but then they can also be, a bridge into policy, or they're bridging into their district. It provides credibility with their colleagues, but it also provides credibility with decision makers, because it's a real, classroom teacher that's speaking from current experience. You might want to talk. Connecticut's done an amazing job with that.
We do that in Connecticut, and with our State Teacher of the Year partners, we've developed a hybrid role so that we have teacher leaders at the department. And I sometimes worry about the phrase teacher leadership, because we all know teaching is leadership. So
Sure.
it's more of a continuum of, where am I trying to make my difference now? And I think I love that idea of thinking of it as a culture of leadership. But I do think the hybrid roles are a structural piece that we can do that makes a difference.
You know, Josh, let me ask one more question, then we'll just broaden the conversation if folks in the audience want to throw questions out there too. I mean, a part of this is this endless challenge, especially in teacher prep. Folks say, "Hey, we're just trying to make sure teachers can go in the classroom and do right by the kids
Right.
before we get to this other
Right.
stuff." And then when we talk about this generally, teachers say, "Well, I like this idea of changing my school in ways that lets my colleagues and I do our best work, but I don't like to. I get real nervous when we start talking about a whole bunch more stuff
Right.
on my to-do list
Right.
that's going to take me away
Sure.
from my kids." And how do you think about this? I mean, this is stuff that you've juggled, and how do you think about it, and how do you advise teachers on it?
I think you have to keep the main thing the main thing. All right. One of the main things that I talk to people in my fellowship about, and even at my school, is that we are in the business of student outcomes. And that's where we have to start the conversation. I think that there are certain things about a building or about a way that we do things that are immutable. You're going to have a fire drill. You're going to have a bloodborne pathogens professional development, right? These things have to happen. But at the end of the day, the stuff that's negotiable after you've taken care of students is where we can have the conversation. And so I try to bring them back to the students, back to the classroom first before we start talking about things, because what can end up happening is that you get in conversations that feel good but don't impact students positively. And so even though there are certain things you want teacher satisfaction, you want teachers to enjoy their job, that's certainly true. But at the end of the day, we want students to achieve at every level, no matter the subgroup, no matter the zip code. And so I try to take them back to that first before we talk about whatever else is going on. In regards to teacher prep programs, though, I really do think that this is a really powerful opportunity, especially in the area of high stakes testing and things of that nature, for us to talk about, and sort of teacher retention as well, with all of the fallout that's happening. We have to talk to our teacher prep programs on covering a comprehensive type approach, right? Which might mean a longer in-service period where teachers are there for longer than a couple of rotations, maybe a year, who knows, right? But we have to cover ethics. We have to cover how to do the cage busting. We have to cover even dealing with an urban environment. For some teachers, going from their teacher prep programs to an inner city environment is like a red shirt year. Like the first year, you're just trying to figure out, what is this, right? And so I think there has to be a more comprehensive teacher preparation program. We got to make time for it. We just have to.
And there's so many places in schools that you wouldn't even have to have a hybrid role. It wouldn't have to be a big, expensive thing on an impact on a district. I think about the high schools that I've been in that still have the model where you have a free period and then you have a duty period. And your duty period, you sit outside the bathroom, or you sit in the hall, or you stand in a corridor for that period, and everybody's accountable to be in a place. And that is, to me, such an opportunity for people to say, why can't teachers that are, in that time frame be working on something more meaningfully? Right? So it wouldn't be an added cost, but it would be something that they could make such better use of their time and build leadership. And that's how I think administrators can create that space as well to support teachers in that.
Yeah, I love that. And I love when you talk to folks in the district, and these duty periods, and are there alternative ways you might do some of this with cameras or and they're like, yeah, and you're like, well, how do we weigh this? And there's just this is the way it's always been done.
Right.
It's not so much that anybody thinks this is the best way to serve kids.
Right.
All right, let's open it up. If any folks have thoughts, questions, catch one of the mics. Just be kind enough to identify yourself by name and affiliation. And if we don't see a question coming in the first 15 seconds, we'll go.
Jim Snyder from Iceland. Two closely related questions. The first is, to what extent is the teacher's contract part of the cage? So often teacher contracts today are literally hundreds of page longs and specify things like how many contact minutes for this and that. So to take an example that Fred uses about after-school tutoring, it's not the administrators. You would be creating an incredible political faux pas. That's not part of the acceptable contact minutes. That's the contract. So to what extent is that the problem? Often today, the policy manual that the school board has is incredibly vague. The real regulations which are enforced are clear is the teacher's contract. That's the cage. And the second,
Well,
very
let's go
closely.
through that one. I love that, and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Can I, I had an example with that. When I was teacher of the year, I was out of the classroom the following year a lot. And we didn't want the kids to be without another history teacher. So two of my colleagues always worked closely with me. They teach the same subject. They knew the curriculum inside and out. So they each took my classes. And it worked out really well. So they used their lunch period and their free period to work with them. And it was the union that stopped it. But I would say this, it was so they stopped them because there's a chain of, if you're not going to be here, the next person in line goes in to sub that class and gets paid. And I understand that. So we said, okay, why don't you send them in anyway? They'll just sit there, but we're still going to do the class. And it was a snag, but I do think that that's something that you can negotiate on a local level and work through. So I think I did not pursue that in the way that I could have for the following year. And I've looked back on that. You only have so much energy and you fight the battles you can.
But for instance, you'll talk to teachers in districts. We've got PLCs. We've got 45 minutes every Monday. It's not that useful. It's not that, and you'll talk to administrators. They'll say, well, it's all the time we get under the contract. How much of this is that the contract does get in the way of teachers being able to devise things that they think will work for their kids at their school or not?
So, honestly, I can only speak from the ones I've worked with, and I think that there are always those glitches. And I would suggest there's more going on with the principals saying the PLCs are functional and teachers not, but that's a whole nother story. I think there's more going on probably in the culture of that school. But I do think that the contract is a challenge. I think the bigger challenge is not changing the contract. It's getting the teachers to really think about what do they want that contract to look like? What are they willing to give up? And I do think in some places that's happening. Even with National Board, we were able to get, I was the first National Board certified teacher in my county, and so I went in and said, what would it look like? And I got contract language, and we put it in and got a stipend for 10 years for being nationally board certified. There's sometimes you don't think about that, and I think that's part of the teacher leadership training is that's not a be-all, end-all. It might hold us this year until we can renegotiate next year, but excellent question.
Okay, second question.
To what extent do contractually specified leave policies really force you, for example, as a school board member, to force teachers to enter this cage? Just to give you an example, in my school districts, there are roughly 181 contact days with students, and teachers, many of them take 10 to 15 days off because you'd be crazy not to do it if you're not a permanent teacher, is to take them because you're just wasting that time. But as a school board member who is concerned about making sure that kids get an adequate curriculum, at least when the substitute teachers are in the classroom, you know what needs to be accomplished, and the kids that want to accomplish things can use textbooks and whatnot. It's there. So the question is, really, is it irresponsible not to force this tight cage when you have so much leave and the teachers aren't in the classroom in many public schools?
I think when we talk about contracts, at least, I'll just say for Connecticut. Connecticut has 206 LEAs, 169 traditional districts. That means 169 different collective bargaining agreements. So the first thing is know your contract, no matter who you are. Right. Know your contract, because you need to know, not based on myth, if the reason you can't run that after school club is because, it says that in the contract. But if in the teacher's contract, they get 15 sick days a year, which is very typical, at least in what I've dealt with everywhere I've been. That doesn't mean that they get 15 paid days off a year. That means that's in case they're sick. And I would say there's something very wrong in the culture of a system where teachers believe that they should take 15 days off a year. And so I would say that the challenge there is not contractual, it's cultural.
I want to tag on to that, to your earlier question. I've never met a teacher in my career yet who was in a building that made them aware of the challenges, gave them agency, where they felt supported, that the contract has ever been an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
My name is Alex. I'm a Fulbright student here, studying public policy at GW from Russia. My question is, as an observer, I can save you the trouble of mentioning the elephant in the room, probably. I guess the elephant in the room is the new political appointment, the new education secretary. How do you think the political appointments can influence the role of the unions that were mentioned so often, as in Harry Potter, the evil guy whose name cannot be mentioned. How can their influence and maybe even their hold on these particular policies that some of them I think are the part of the cage can be influenced within next 4 or 8 years? Thank you.
I thought the elephant in the room you were going to say was Russia, but but okay. I think there are. I think political appointments, especially at the federal level, always have some sort of impact on policy in the unions. But I think, to be honest, unions, especially we have a wonderful union, though, WTU in D.C. I think they act on the interests of their members more so, and they want to take into account, of course, political appointees, but from what I've heard so far with our new secretary, I think she and other secretaries before her have been about how we're going to get the best educational options for the kids. Like I want to keep bringing this conversation back to when we start getting to these political back and forths, the kids are not in the room. We have to bring the kids in the room. They have to be in the seat. They have to start the discussion. They have to end the discussion. And anything else is irrelevant. It's about the adults. And so I think that most unions, from my experience, I've been in 2 districts, they really focus on protecting the rights of the teachers. And the federal have all these other things to take care of with Title I funds and Title II funds and things of that nature. That's what I've seen. I'm sure there's influence there. I just have seen a separation there.
I would think most teachers would feel that way. So I'm from New Jersey, and we have a very strong union, which I'm really thankful for. And one of the things they did, probably going back 10 years ago, is they decided they're going beyond bread and butter unionism and really looking at how can teachers get the professional learning they need and the support they need. And most recently, they've expanded that to even go to how do we, as a union, as an association, support teacher leaders. And they crafted a teacher leader endorsement bill, which was passed last year, and currently it's under review with an advisory board looking at how that will look when it's fully implemented. But they've been really, and I'm not even sure I feel so great about the bill. It has some drawbacks and so forth. It's always a give and take. But the idea is they felt that there are so many teachers that are doing great leadership work that let's make sure it's not just discounted, that it needs to be valued. So they've, I think, done some really great work, and I think they'll continue to do that regardless of the administration's change, and we roll with it as teachers. It's nothing new to us.
Talk over you, but I will say also, I'm thinking about ESSA, and ESSA provides a lot of opportunity for flexibility at the state level when it comes to teacher leadership, when it comes to these accountability measures. I know that's, accountability is kind of in the weeds right now, but in general, ESSA really opens up the flexibility for teacher leadership, for innovative ways to assess students. And so I think the government is not about influencing unions. I think they're about what's the best policy that we can put out that students can succeed.
Actually,
Great question.
so this is actually a terrific note. We'll have a chance to continue the conversation right after over refreshments. But let me ask you guys this as by way of closing question. On this ESSA point, ESSA specifically gives states new leeway for how they think about leadership and leadership development for teachers, for administrators. If there was one thing that you would like to see states wrestling with or thinking about as they tackle professional development for teacher leaders, what's one thing that you would encourage states to make sure that they've got front and center?
So I have this dream that every state Department of Ed, and I know there's lots of challenges with this, but that they would have a teacher leader advisory board within their state, modeled after a board I used to serve on around professional development, where you would have the majority of members be teacher leaders and work with all the other stakeholders, representatives as well. And though that would be at a state level, which I would love to see that meeting monthly, looking at research, looking at promising practices, looking at their own state, taking inventory. Where do we have leaders? Where's there a culture of leadership? What can we do to support it? That would be, to me, something that I would love to see happen on a policy level.
Building expertise around content, around changing populations, and around how to deal with the politics of a system.
That's great. Wendy? Dan?
Well, so I would actually say, I know you're asking about specific topics, but I'm thinking in my mind the process that they should use, which is instead of making blanket decisions based off of people who maybe were in the classroom previously, talking to teachers who are currently in the classroom. Peggy mentioned an advisory board, but I would even say states making the effort to do focus groups and listening sessions throughout their states. I know there are a number of states the commissioners have actually gone out to do listening sessions across their states, surveys. There are a lot of different ways that state departments of ed can actually hear directly from their stakeholders and make a decision based off of the need from those constituents.
Diana, fittingly last word, since you can actually act on your own advice.
Well, one of the things we've tried to do in our ESSA plan that we'll be submitting is push the decision making closer to the kids, so that people are using information about the kids they're teaching to choose the kind of professional learning that they need. And then what's going to be tougher for us as a state is figuring out how to be responsive to those needs, because it's a whole lot easier to decide everybody needs, you know, X, Y, and Z instruction. But that's what we're trying to build for the future.
That's great. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for a terrific conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Before we go, just want to remind everybody here and watching that if you want to check out the new Cage Busted curriculum, go to the AI website. You'll find all 7 modules up there free. This is a crucial topic, and one that we will all continue to be talking about ad nauseum in the days ahead. If you want to be able to revisit this video, you'll find it on the AEI site. Otherwise, hope you guys have a terrific day. Thank you so much for joining us.